Okay, I'm here with Christian Holst from Baymard Institute in your lovely office in Copenhagen, and thank you for inviting me. I'd like to talk a little bit about your upcoming talk at Conversionboost 2020.
Yeah.
You were there last year, a very popular talk, and we just decided to have you straight back the following year, so we'll see you again in March. Could you talk a little bit about Baymard Institute? What is Baymard Institute? What's your role there?
I am the co-founder and research director at the Baymard Institute, and what we do at the Baymard Institute, and have been doing for the last 9 years now, or 10 years actually, is that we conduct a large-scale e-commerce user experience research. So that means we typically don't do very much client-specific work, where we test just one site for a specific client. Rather, we test a broad spectrum of e-commerce sites to uncover what are general patterns in user behavior and see how do users react to certain design patterns. Are there any design patterns in e-commerce that we can see to consistently perform poorly or consistently perform well?
Okay.
And that's basically our purpose, what we try to uncover.
Yeah.
And so far we have then conducted 42,000 hours of such research.
Yeah.
Which have led to a database that we call Baymard Premium, where we essentially analyze and store all of these research findings for e-commerce companies to then use within their own organization, basically to inform and empower their decisions. So there are, for instance, some 50,000 best and worst practice examples of what exact design implementations perform poorly and well within e-commerce.
Okay.
So that's sort of the whole idea here, something that can help and assist you in your decision-making process.
Yeah.
Try to inject some of that research that can be very difficult or time-consuming to do on an ad hoc basis. If you just have a small question, do you go out and do a 2-month user testing study yourself?
Yeah.
Most people can't afford or wait that long for getting input into their decisions. So they just make decisions without research.
Yeah.
So.
And your database, it's about 700 plus guidelines of
Exactly.
of sort of design patterns, sort of best practice.
Yeah.
Gathered from which type of websites? Which websites do you test in order to create these guidelines?
We test a broad variety of e-commerce sites. So it's generally e-commerce sites that sell some kind of products. So some kind of sites with a transaction, or at least where users can indicate a desire to purchase something. So it can also be sites where you don't actually purchase, but more make a reservation. But e-commerce defined quite broadly, you could say.
Yeah.
And then we test across a broad spectrum of industries, so we cover all the sort of normal industries within e-commerce, and then we test across a broad spectrum of users.
Yeah.
So both users in North America and in Europe.
Obviously, looking at so many websites with so many users, I feel like if I need to ask anyone about what's going on in the business, where are things going, could you say something about challenges for web shops? Because you've seen a lot of users with in front of a lot of web shops. Could you say something about what do you see across your research about where do web shops or websites struggle these days?
Well, there are some of the common offenders, unfortunately, that we've seen been quite persistent. Actually, dating all the way back to 2014, we have quite consistently seen something such as e-commerce search being a major issue, and it still is.
And when you say major issue, it's because you see a lot of users struggling with the search.
Exactly. Or we also see that e-commerce sites basically have an implementation that fundamentally misalign with how users actually try to search.
Yeah.
So just one example. It was last week we released a new e-commerce search UX benchmark database specifically for e-commerce search, and we found that 60% of the world's largest e-commerce sites, if users go to these sites and type what we call a synonym query, so that is they are looking for a hairdryer and they then type hairdryer, they will get 5 results, while the site in reality sells 100 blow dryers, which is the American-centric term for the very same product type.
Yeah.
So basically 60% of sites are not able to return all the relevant results if users search by their own query or own terminology. They have to use the site's terminology. It could also be something like If users search for a multifunctional printer, they will get 5 results, while the site actually sells 2,000 all-in-one printers, because that's the new official term for what used to be a multifunction printer, right?
Yeah.
And it's even basic attributes like this where the largest 60% of the largest e-commerce sites fail.
Yeah. The
In
biggest crime of all, having a product on sale that users can't find.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And following still this example, what we see in testing is that if users search for hairdryer and get 5 results, they will literally take it as this site, say Target or Amazon, is saying to me, we have 5 hairdryers.
Yeah.
They will not second guess the site's ability to search their product catalog and say, I probably used the wrong synonym.
Yeah.
If they knew the synonym, they would have searched by it in the first place, right?
Yeah.
So that's a fundamental issue of e-commerce.
Yeah.
And it's 60% now, here in December 2019. It was 61% in 2017, and it was 65% in 2014. So also saying there is very little progress or very slow progress in a lot of these fundamental misalignment with user behavior and what sites are actually capable of doing within search.
Okay, so looking at so many websites over so long, do you see a pattern? Do you see trends coming? What are we going to look at for e-commerce in the future? Something that is growing or happening right now? What would you mention?
So there are obviously a lot of trends in terms of technology and also design patterns.
Yeah.
We focus mostly though on trends in actual user behavior. So where do we see user behavior or mostly user expectations start to change or evolve? Obviously a lot can be driven by technology, but a lot of the trends you often see in terms of designs and technology are mainly driven by industry experts. Developers often like the fancy new technology. Designers often like the fancy new design patterns. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily good for users.
True.
So we tend to focus on what are the trends and evolvement in user behavior. And within that, we see there are definitely some trends or some patterns. Generally, we see that there is an increase in how users engage with images on e-commerce sites, that they are generally expecting larger and larger images, for instance on product details pages of higher quality, and also more images. So the old model of getting away with the product depicted from 4 different angles, that's definitely something we see to now perform very poorly with users. If that's the only imagery you have, even if it's high quality, that's not enough. Users want feature call-out images, lifestyle images, in particular in-scale images where you can see the size of the product in comparison to something else. Those type of images and image content is definitely a trend in user expectations that we see are only increasing now. We also see that users' expectations for what they can search for is also increasing. It have been increasing for the past many years, but it continues to increase. And this is actually a non-e-commerce factor mainly driving this. It's because users are getting more and more familiar with the more abstract or advanced search possibilities you have in traditional web search engines like Google search. And then they carry over their expectations from Google search or Facebook search to basically any website. But within e-commerce, it sets the bar quite high because e-commerce search engines don't function nearly as well as web search engines. That, for instance, are very good at handling something as word synonyms, which e-commerce sites aren't. So that's also an area where we see that users just keep having higher and higher expectations, and the implementation of e-commerce sites aren't really following suit. Actually, in both regards to image content and search engine capabilities. Yeah,
and I'm thinking with the development of mobile phones, users are getting so used to having images of high quality that they can almost make themselves. So of course their expectations to the imagery on the website is must also increase. So that makes sense. And also it's always interesting with e-commerce because there is so much best practice going on, because most of the time, like Jacob Nielsen says, your user spends time on someone else's website, and so you take what you get there and bring it to your website. I think that really makes sense in terms of your database, in the sense like, well, you have to remember you can't sort of create your own your own web shop, you need to follow the trends, because that's what's shaping your users.
Yeah, exactly, and we definitely see that come into play quite often. That it's not that you should just copy other e-commerce sites in full, and not neither sites or whole page layouts. That's actually not what's really meant by following best practices and following web conventions. It's more when you look at the component level.
Yeah.
So if you want an interface, say on a product page, where you want to collapse or truncate part of a product description because it's too long and it pushes other sections down the page, if you want to truncate then part of the description, how do you then do it? And those are the instances where you don't want to reinvent the wheel and be really ingenious and come up with your own design pattern, because you want users to be able to instantly recognize, here part of this product description is truncated, this is how you reveal all of the hidden content. You need users to instantly get that. And if you have a completely new idea for how to do that, it's actually not a very good thing for end users. Even if your idea is objectively better, you could still argue it's not good for end users, because they're used to a truncation looking in a certain way. Usually part of the last word is truncated with some dots. Typically the truncation trigger is a plus, and then it says reveal more. If you're really good, you also tell how much more, what more you are revealing. And if you're really fancy, you also fade out the last 2 lines of the truncated text, so users can literally see that there's something here that's hidden. That's usually a good way to indicate that. We can imagine many other ways. We could sit and have like a good design discussion on how can we indicate this in other ways, but it's usually not a good way of spending resources, because when it comes to these, you can say somewhat standard challenges, how do I hide some content and then show that it can be revealed? That's like a classical pattern where you just want users to instantly recognize it. And there you want to tap into how have all other sites or the average large site in the world done this before me.
Sure, and when users talk about something being convenient or intuitive, basically what they're saying is like they recognize the pattern and it behaves the way that they expect. When I look at your user sessions, some of the results, like you can almost hear users going like, oh, I recognize that, oh, I don't, or I expect it to behave like this.
Certainly. And in that way, you can say it's within the e-commerce industry, there's often a tendency to look very much and sort of what are the largest e-commerce sites doing, or thinking e-commerce as an isolated thing, but it's not. Users spend most of their time not necessarily in e-commerce sites. Some of the largest sites are Google web search, so their expectations for how you search come from Google search, not necessarily from how search functions at Nike or Adidas. Their expectations for how images work come from Instagram, not necessarily from how the images are laid out at ASUS, right?
Exactly, so and that's also why your guidelines is not just like top 10 biggest websites, and you can't say, okay, look at that website, they do the whole thing right. It's a combination of all the patterns all together. So happy to have you back next year, by popular demand, I would say. So that's really cool.
Happy to be back,
and but then what can we expect from you next year at Conversion Boost?
So we will obviously include a set of new research findings. If you were there last year, then you know my talk. I've cherry-picked sort of 6 major fundamental e-commerce UX design research findings, where we see that they are both highly important to end users, but at the same time our benchmarking reveal that most e-commerce sites get these aspects wrong. So it's things that actually matter to the end user experience, but the average site can improve within these areas at the same time. We are still wrapping up the last details, for instance, for our mobile UX research study. So I will bring some specific findings. We are now seeing mobile navigation, the mobile main navigation. There is a particular interesting design pattern there, where we actually found that if you have a responsive website and you just scale down your obviously you don't scale down the main navigation. It's one of the things that you actually redesign if you have a responsive site. But if you are even reusing the structure of your desktop main navigation, even in a mobile optimized design, we see that that structure by default will underperform with users. There is typically a small restructuring you have to do of your structure, or at least how you convey your structure to users in mobile main navigations. So it's an area that we see is obviously high impact. It is the mobile main nav, but it's also an area where we see that most sites fail because by default you get it wrong. Because most sites just optimize the mobile nav design and not also make small changes to the structure as well. And you need to.
Which is a challenge that many companies must see now, trying to grasp what are we going to do on mobile, and to some degree everybody understands now you can't just like do the same thing on both platforms, but what you're saying is you need to go a step, you can see that you need to go a step even deeper into the changes.
And we have other similar findings, similar findings that I'll also be presenting. So generally areas where there's a very high chance that even if you have a responsive site, then you will almost by default get it wrong on mobile. Those I think are some of the most interesting research findings, because even if you have actually spent quite some time on your mobile site, there is a very high chance that it will still misalign with users, because it's not just about scaling things down and reflowing elements, it's elements that you actually have to design differently on mobile, or sometimes even change substantially on mobile.
So cool, very interesting. Look forward to it.